And now we are recording again. So yes, you guys are going to have the wonders of extra credit opportunity, or not, sorry, the King of the Hill, which remember, you can take that as many times as you want. It only records your highest grade, and whoever gets the highest grade overall is going to get an immediate 50 points of extra credit to their final grade in the class. So, and because of phys is so few points for the entire semester, that 50 points ends up being almost a full letter grade.
Okay.
So whoever gets the high score, that, congratulations. I'm obviously constantly grading, so I'm still getting through the grading for you guys along with all my other classes. So just kind of keep checking in on that and you'll see it. So right now, what I'm working on here is I'm putting together an excess post-exercise oxygen consumption. So by putting together a graph that creates this, what's known as a second order polynomial relationship, we're showing how it's kind of leveling out as we go through time, which means I probably need to add one here that's going to be 2.5 minutes post, and then putting that at about 138. So if we go 2.5, yeah, it'll kind of help make this graph fit. And we notice it's not perfect, but it gives us an idea. And so in reality, I think if I drop down my final number, yeah, that's going to strengthen it up. And so the idea is I would take this graph and then take effectively the area under the curve here. So it's effectively using calculus, but we can just kind of create its own baseline. We can then extrapolate as to how many extra calories somebody's going to be burning during this phase. So I'm making this for a friend of mine who's a long distance runner and he wants something they can kind of tabulate, and by putting it in Google, obviously I can share it with other people. But the problem is Google Charts doesn't give you a slope and an intercept. So, or at least I don't know how to do that yet. Speaking of my own things that I need to work on, because if I can get that formula, then we can drop them in here to the A term, B term, and C term, and effectively from there get our estimate based upon the person's resting metabolic rate. So applying the stuff we're talking about in class with the understanding that it's never perfect. In fact, it probably has a lot of errors, so it's going to have a lot of errors in it, but at least it gives somebody something they can work from. Now, we left off, and I've got our wonderful review picture up here. Today, first, obviously, we don't have exactly a huge amount of attendance, but are there any questions, anything that we've gone through in the class or otherwise that you would like me to spend some time going into and working through with you guys?
No, I don't really have any questions specifically.
Okay.
Me either.
Nothing, Gracie? Okay.
No.
All right. Yeah, we might do technology is a agreement. So guys, can you still the computer seems to be completely checked? If you can put that in the chat.
Would you be able to say that again? I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you.
No, it's okay. My computer is freaking out on me, and it's running incredibly slow, so I have no idea what the heck's going on. The final lab, Will, is going to be doing the burpees on for time, and then also doing a YMCA step test and seeing how those relate. Those are all up in the lab part if you go on Blackboard, and then you're going to go ahead and perform the exercises as listed, and then enter your data into the Google Sheets that I made for the class. And then once everybody gets all their data in there, you guys are gonna be able to look at it and go ahead and say what you found.
Okay, thank you.
No worries. Okay, good. I feel like we might be back a little bit. Can you guys hear me a bit better now?
I can, at least.
You will. Okay, well, it just shut down a bunch of random things on my computer, so I'm going to guess that's for the best. And I'm going to go ahead and hopefully get my class stuff from xphys, get that review slide back up. All right. So when we're talking about the different systems, specifically, we're going to go ahead and spend a little bit of time today talking a little bit about the basics of the neurological system. So our central nervous system, we're talking about our brain or spinal cord or peripherals being all the information out. Afferent is our sensory information going in. Efferent is our information going out to our muscles, to our GI, to our other systems, telling them what to do. Now, the big key to keep in mind about all of this is this information always takes time to send. The information that we're getting in from our retinas of our eyes, going back through optic nerve, through the thalamus, and then being processed by the occipital lobe. The information that we're receiving from our hearing, then going and being transposed into or through the nerve cells inside of our inner ear, which is then going into our temporal lobe and then being made into something that's sensible. So we always have a lag with any information we're taking in, touch receptors, Golgi tendon organs, muscle spindles. Yes, some of them do go from the spinal cord, but it also gives our nervous system information about where our body's at. Now, those different regions of the brain, the hippocampus for memory, the amygdala for fear response, the pons for and medulla oblongata for lower level things like just simply breathing, maintaining heart rate, our cerebrum for all of our major processing, the frontal lobe for making good decisions, which remember, the prefrontal cortex is one of the last things to mature, and that's what helps you make good decisions. which explains why some people, and it matures at different rates. On average, a female's theirs matures 2 years before a male's, which once again explains why certain people behave the way they do. But then as they get older, they tend to be obviously making a little bit more or hopefully better decisions. Then we've got our hypothalamus, which in turn is cueing into our pituitary gland, which leads right into the hormonal system, which in turn we'll get into. And from there, we also have got our autonomic nervous system, which the sympathetic being the fight or flight, the parasympathetic being the rest or digest. And we typically, for the most of the day, want to be in pretty high parasympathetic tone. We're very relaxed, our body is able to recover, and obviously we're getting lots of sleep. Now, sympathetic tone is really great when you have to do things that require high power output, high aggression, anything along those lines, the fight or flight response. Now, that's something we want to be able to tap into and be able to control our athletes with, because we're going to find that inverted U of performance. And that if we go too high on the sympathetic nervous system, we literally are going to effectively just freak out. That's where someone's going to be trying to hit a baseball and it looks like they couldn't hit the broadside of a barn, or they completely mess up a throw, completely mess up a play, where you hear about the little kids on occasion scoring on their own team because, once again, they go high in the sympathetic, they panic and they do it wrong. And you don't want to be too low on the sympathetic nervous system when you talk about those innervations, aka if you're asleep, you're not going to be able to hit a baseball or a softball in the first place. We want to be in the optimal range in the middle. Now, the optimal range is different depending on the athlete, and obviously the stress of hitting batting practice is not the same as the stress of hitting in a game, which is not the same as the stress of that bottom of the ninth, 2 outs, bases loaded, full count stress. And obviously, if our own U is shaped like so, we're going to do okay at batting practice, and we're not going to do great in that bottom of the ninth, but we're going to do great during normal games. And that's where you get the athletes that when they get in the postseason, they can have a really bad time with performance. They fall apart because of the extra pressure and they're not prepared for it. And then on the other side, you have certain athletes that do great in those higher pressure situations because that's where their individual U is at. So by understanding the parasympathetic nervous system and the sympathetic nervous system, we can start making some decisions about how we approach teaching, how we approach coaching, and how we want people to have to get used to higher stress situations if their actual life is going to encounter them. So obviously, if you're going to be someone that has to give a lot of public speeches, you want to start off with just giving a speech in front of friends, and then a larger group and a larger group and a larger group. You don't want to go from having no practice to all of a sudden having to perform in front of an arena full of people. But we're going to slowly allow ourselves to get exposed to that higher sympathetic drive so that we in turn can physically start to understand how it feels to be up higher and how that influences our performance, what we need to do to try to slow ourselves down or speed ourselves up in certain cases if an athlete isn't up for it enough for what they need to do. And that's where we can talk about things like modulating breath, imagery, and even things like music can help bring us up or bring us down in that essentially autonomic nervous system. So make sure you guys go through there, make sure you guys feel comfortable with those structures, what they do, why we might want to have improvements in one or another in order so we can have better performance. Remember, we also have that cerebellum, which is going to help with the fine motor skills and that balance and control. And it's important that obviously it has a pretty high amount of development in a number of sports, since obviously skill is a major component of what separates people. Now, when it comes to our hormones, obviously we've got a litany of glands, the pituitary being the chief one, which we talked about a bit earlier. Now, the pituitary gland is in turn going to release signaling hormones to your thyroid, to your gonads, to your adrenals, among just releasing growth hormone in general, which is in turn going to cause those glands to produce more or less of whatever hormone that we're looking for, along with it's going to tell our body to recover a little bit more from training or otherwise. So when we're then looking at that pituitary, or looking at the thyroid gland, looking at the gonads, looking at the adrenals, understanding that if we don't have normal function through our pituitary, we're going to have a lot of systems that can get disrupted. Hence why concussions can be really, really bad for all of the systems in the body, not just something like balance, not just something like our ability to see, because our brain has so much fine control of so many different systems in the body that we can have a lot of dysfunction if we're not careful. Now, from there, a thyroid hormone producing that T3 and T4, which are going to be really important. Also, the parathyroid is going to be producing calcitonin, which is going to help a little bit with bone mineralization, so that is still important. Then, obviously, we have the gonads. Now we're talking about testosterone. We're talking about estradiol. We're talking about progesterone. We're talking about DHEA and dihydroxytestosterone, DHT, and all of those are going to influence health and athletic performance. From our adrenals, whether we're talking the cortex and the medulla, we've got cortisol, we've got epinephrine and norepinephrine, along with, we're going to go ahead and have aldosterone when we're talking about balancing our fluid levels inside of our body. So all of those are really important. Our pancreas is going to be releasing that insulin or glucagon accordingly, so that we're going to be able to modulate our blood sugar levels. And then we're going to still have that global effective growth hormone, which, remember, increases the size and function of every single tissue type in the body except for your actual fat. That's the only system that's actually going to decrease in size from the use. Now, keep in mind, insulin and growth hormone are both big peptide hormones. Hence why, in order to typically take them, you need to do them via injection. Whereas your cholesterol-based hormones, your steroid hormones, those you can take orally. Yeah, they can put some stress on your liver, and otherwise, if anything, it's arguably going to be safer for the long term to do some form of injection, depending on the type you're doing. Obviously, female birth control is pretty comfortable with giving people over-the-counter servings of it, but there's still some situations there just to be mindful of because a lot of stress. And then we get to our individual amino acid hormones, our epinephrine, norepinephrine, and our thyroid hormones, thyroxine and triiodine, which in turn are going to be just individual amino acids that have been modified. So you can actually take those orally because you can't absorb them. So understanding how our endocrine system is going to regulate our health and is going to regulate our performance. And how with really hard, stressful training, and specifically with under recovery, you can see a decrease in testosterone and increase in cortisol, which is bad. That's literally showing that we're not going to be able to recover as well as we could before. And we're starting to get into that overreaching stage with an athlete. So we want to back things down so that we're going to be able to recover a little bit better and perform on a slightly higher level. Now, that is a real short, real fast overview of a whole lot of things. Any questions on the neurological or the endocrine system that you would like me to go ahead and dive down a little deeper on, guys?
Yeah, I don't know if my audio is coming in clearly or not.
I can hear you.
Okay, cool. I was wanting to ask though, just about this recent assignment to the take home number 3 assignment.
Yeah.
It was asking about if you're wanting a swimmer or a person with like, what would you do with their endocrine system?
Mm-hmm.
So I was just wondering if you would be able to touch more on that with the assignment, what specifically their endocrine system.
Yeah, good. Well, think about what are the hormones that help with recovery, what are the hormones that help with performance, and what are the hormones that help with just overall health. Like, you probably don't want to play with anybody's thyroid levels other than make sure they're normal. You don't probably want to play with their insulin and glucagon levels, just that they maintain normal blood sugar. And with swimming and aldosterone, you don't really have to worry too much about sweating unless the pool is really warm, which is a different situation. But now we're going to start talking about, obviously, our sex hormones. We're going to be talking about growth hormone. And then we're going to be talking about that cortisol. And also our autonomic nervous system, sympathetic tone of our epinephrine and norepinephrine. So we want them to have really good control of their natural epinephrine, norepinephrine release so that when it's time for them to go, they can ramp that thing up and go fast, go hard. We want them to be able to release cortisol when they're training, but have it at a pretty low level throughout the rest of the day to really help them recover. We want them to be able, probably to have higher testosterone and growth hormone than an average human. So that way they're going to also recover faster throughout the rest of the day.
Yeah, that's true. I was kind of unsure if you were looking for like a specific answer there, because I just generally labeled like growth hormone, and like norepinephrine, and epinephrine, and then I think one other really just like broader general hormones to use. So I didn't know if there's something more specific there. You were just wanting it to be for like swimming, but I guess all of those could apply. I think my answer should have been fine.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's like anything else. There are situations where you'd want to play with thyroid hormone.
Mhm.
Play being the operative term. If you know someone's going to be in a really um, either not necessarily really hot environment, but more they're going to be going with very, very low amounts of calories for long periods of time, you'd actually want to probably naturally decrease their thyroid hormone production. Now, this is a complete thought exercise. This is something that you should never do, ever. That's why people become medical doctors and then become endocrinologists within that specialization, and then still have issues with getting people's thyroid meds to work perfectly for them. So this is a thought exercise, nothing to do. Let me throw that out there with everything I say here. Now, when it comes to then if they're in a really cold environment, well, you want to ramp up that thyroid hormone. So that way they naturally have a higher resting metabolic rate, which in turn is going to keep them warm and probably make them feel a bit more comfortable in those endeavors. And so there's situations where you might want to modulate that. Let's say you're working with somebody that's a archer, they do riflery or otherwise. You probably want to have it so that their autonomic nervous system, specifically their epinephrine response, nearly doesn't exist. Like, have that so blunted that it doesn't matter how high of a stressful situation they have to take their shot in. It still is like you guys just getting up and brushing your teeth. Like, it doesn't, there's no stress. It's super easy for them to do. So you never have to worry about them getting in the wrong part of that inverted U. They're just always going to sit perfectly at the top for their own performance and never have a decrement there. And then on the other side, if you got somebody that has to, fight other human beings, you want them to be able to ramp that thing up and then ramp it right back down quickly. Because the problem is when we're in that really super high fight or flight response, that's when we have some really interesting aberrations where you can see changes in perception of time. You can have such vasoconstriction to the skin that you literally won't bleed like you should from superficial wounds. And then you can have things like tunnel vision. So they literally can't take in more than what's exactly in front of them, along with auditory exclusion and a number of other events that turns out don't make for people getting along with other people very well. And a great example of if you want to see people that are in sympathetic overdrive and getting out of hand, look no further than professional brain damage ball, where you can see examples of literally guys stomping on other human beings. Not necessarily, I mean, who knows? A number of them probably are D-bags, but I would surmise to say that a number of those guys are just that freaking fired up that they can't turn it off, that they are in that kind of that blind rage at that point. And so having the ability to, like, the play is over and then you shut it back down and you're back to being a normal person, and then plays back on, turn it back on and ramp and go, that's far more useful because you're going to probably make better decisions in those contexts than when the whistle stops, I stop, which obviously is not how things always go. And that's because we're dealing with physiology that doesn't work that quickly, especially when we're talking about hormones that are longer lasting.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that sounds good.
Yeah. Abby, do you have any questions that I can go ahead and field for you?
I actually don't have any right now. Thank you, though.
Okay. And then Gracie, anything else you'd like me to go and highlight?
No, sir. Sorry it took so long. I was trying to get myself off mute.
No, it's okay. This thing's been acting weird, and I'll be interested to see what we even managed to save and record, or if it's going to have like the 10 minutes of me panicking trying to figure out how to get this thing to work again. Now, one thing when we're talking about muscle. Now, remember, when it comes to fast twitch fiber, or it comes to, muscle fiber type, remember, we have not just our type 1, or type 2A and type 2X, but we have the hybrid fibers between the two, so that gives us a certain amount of plasticity. Training is going to influence us one direction or the other. It tends to always, training influence us to get away from the type 2X into the type 2A or the type 1. And then obviously resistance training more the 2A, aerobic training more the type 1, which gives us that plasticity, which is good. Now, the other big component is, remember that our skeletal muscle have multiple nuclei. And the multiple nuclei are going to be important for obviously protein turnover. We increase that number via resistance training and then also through things like testosterone. So there's some conversations and really interesting research looking into how long those extra nuclei stay in the cell, which might literally lead to some arguments that if somebody fails a drug test, they can never play the sport again because they have an unfair advantage for the rest of their life. And obviously then it lends itself to some very interesting conversations about trans athletes, and specifically more of male converting to female if that gentleman, I'm probably using the wrong term, so please forgive me if I am, when transitioning to a female has already gone through puberty and had the advantage of testosterone for a number of years, is going to have a very different amount of lean mass compared to a female that was always female. So, it lends to some interesting conversations about trans athletes and, how and what is fair as far as competition, which is worth having the conversations as mature adults, not as yelling at each other and just being mean, because that doesn't really ever help anything. But the other thing when we talk about that architecture and the multinucleation is understanding that we also have the capillaries feeding that muscle. And so there's arguments that's another limiter on how big your muscle can get, because literally the capillaries can only shuttle so many nutrients to an individual fiber, and it needs enough to go ahead and have that turnover. There's some other arguments on the amount of natural ribosomal content, which is important for the protein building, which obviously is also helped by the nucleation of the cell, which is fascinating to think as far as a limit for how big a muscle can get. So they refer to the myonuclear domain as the amount of area that one nuclei can effectively service. So if we've got one nuclei that can service this much of an area, but we want to, and the muscle's this size, that's great because we can get the muscle bigger until it gets to that point. But we can't go beyond because that nuclei can't cover that anymore. Hence the activation of those satellite cells, which in turn are going to undergo their own mitosis, and then one of them is going to fuse to the damaged fiber to allow for the increase in nucleation, which in turn is going to allow for the increase in performance. The capillaries being a limiting factor again on literally how much nutrient we can deliver to the area, and if we can't deliver enough nutrients, we can't literally build enough protein and have enough turnover to maintain that mass, because muscle is really expensive, which would then argue why you naturally have a limit as you get older and as you train more and more, and that it becomes that much harder to increase your muscular size and function. So remember that we do have those hybrid fibers that give us plasticity and our ability to effectively be able to transition a little bit more to whatever athletic endeavor we happen to be doing. The key difference between the fiber types is really just comes down to fatigability and, more importantly, power output. Between them, you can get your 2As to start taking on characteristics of your type 1 and your type 1 to start taking on characteristics of your type 2As. But understanding, like anything else, we have these proteins there. We are finite beings, and we are only able to effectively service a certain amount of size and region in those areas. And it's something that's worth having a conversation with, and about and understanding like what's feasible. So I just think that's fun stuff. But then again, that's why I have a PhD in it, because I really enjoy learning about it. What other questions, comments, concerns do you guys have for me? Or you guys okay with calling it a day and having yourself a nice Friday?
Again, I don't know how good the audio is, but no, I really don't have any more questions.
Sounds good to me.
All right, guys. Well, keep staying safe out there, guys. Take care of yourselves, and yeah, make sure you guys are staying on top of that King of the Hill. Remember, best grade on that gets an extra 50 points in the semester. It's gonna be live until I think the weekend before finals, and then obviously you guys just have one more lab and one more quiz, and then you guys are going to be done with all of the actual grading stuff that we got going on. So, stay on top of everything. Let me know if you have any other questions, comments, concerns, and we're going to keep reviewing again next week. So my thing for you guys is have a chapter. Look at, I do think this review slide and the video for it is also online. I think it's 2 parts if you want to watch it, but plan on coming to the class on Monday and having questions and things that we can go ahead and delve into. So in the interim, stay safe out there, guys. Thanks for listening, and hopefully see you guys soon. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye.
See ya.